The impact that it had on my children, I actually had no idea at the time. I believed that I sheltered them from most of what happened and kept them safe. And that was 8 years ago now, and time has shown me that they were impacted far more drastically than I thought. For years I stayed because I believed it was what was right to do for them, and now I believe that it's best to leave a relationship like that because of the impact it has on them. They were traumatized to an end that I'm not sure I can even describe. They understand relationships between partners to be abusive. They understand that it's okay to be disrespectful and it's okay to be a bully. They all suffered impact through school. We have dealt with drug and alcohol dependencies, issues with the law. So it has been really far-reaching in how it's impacted them.
Well, the impact on kids witnessing domestic violence is pretty terrible, to be honest. I mean, if you think about the level of stress and coping that children have to deal with what they've been exposed to. And typically with kids, we see a variety of symptoms ranging from hypervigilance or hyperarousal, avoidance, numbing, intrusive images, nightmares, and so on. No child is unaffected by violence. There's no such thing as a child being invulnerable to the exposure to violence. But the younger the child, the more likely it is that their basic emotional security is completely disrupted.
We have many concerns for children living in abusive families, and the concerns range from the short-term impacts right through to long-term impacts. Many of the experiences of living with violence shape what children learn and their development. So everything from their views on the world as to whether it's a secure or safe place, whether they are isolated from others, as one of the dynamics of domestic violence is to isolate, in terms of emotional compromises, whether depression or anxiety. So many possible impacts on children.
Most kids have to make some sort of adaptation to living with violence, so they have to acclimatize to it. And as a consequence, they end up seeing it as a normal, for them, event in their lives, and don't realize that they're chronically hypervigilant or hyperaroused as a consequence of it. So these are kids who can't settle, who can't be comforted, who can't be reassured, who unfortunately have a very low empathy for other kids. Because of the suffering that they've endured themselves, they have their own capacity to be empathic has been affected. So they really are not able to put themselves into other kids' shoes and think about what it's like for those kids.
The safety of children becomes a great concern if there's an impending separation or an actual separation. That's one of the key risk factors for children. It also becomes an issue if there's an escalation in the violence. And it also depends on the stage of development. So a younger child, a toddler, an infant, are much more likely to be very close to their mother. And so if escalation occurs and there's physical assaults, then that child is at risk of accidental injury, as well as if the child becomes a pawn on the part of the abusive individual, then the child can be deliberately harmed in trying to control the adult victim. One of the main system gaps is the failure for linkages between family court system and the criminal court system, so that decisions are being made in family court without the knowledge that should inform those decisions from criminal matters. That's one. Another type of gap that we have is in many jurisdictions, children's mental health centers, a source of great resource to mothers and their children, often refuse to see families or children, work with children, if their parents are in the middle of a custody and access dispute. So the very thing that could be in place to help identify escalation and risk, for a child to have a safe place to talk, and for risk assessments to occur, those children often aren't seen. When they are seen, the parent has to sign off often that they will not in any way have anything from the mental health center subpoenaed or called to court. So often that families either don't go through with the help or they do, but it's not as helpful as it could be.
I think our courts don't take enough time to assess both the danger that the violent father represents to his or her children, nor the safety strategies that battered mothers have used to protect themselves and their children. I think consistently courts, court evaluators, and others underestimate the danger that a man who batters his wife represents to his children, and also underestimates the degree of safety strategies that battered mothers are using to protect themselves and their children on a daily basis.
Perhaps one of the most important things is to be always aware of children. Domestic violence in and of itself is an adult issue. And yet it's so important that we don't lose sight of children, whether we be a first responder and being aware of the presence of children, or whether we're trying to evaluate risk and safety plan as we go through. And I think often we miss an opportunity by not talking to children and establishing a rapport with children, and in a safe setting, inviting them to share any safety concerns they have. Of course, if they don't have safety concerns, that doesn't mean that they aren't in a potentially dangerous situation. But often, when things escalate to a certain point, children are very worried or have insights that they can share that would be very helpful and important for us not to overlook.
So I've had judges make rulings that say, well, he's beaten his wife, but he's never touched the children, therefore he can be a good father. I think the courts need to pay attention to the impact of that violent behavior to the mother of these children on the children themselves. And that's one area where I've done research for almost 20 years now, is looking at the impact of adult-to-adult domestic violence on the children in the home. And it varies greatly among children, depending on the protective and risk factors present in their lives. But what I find is that that's overlooked, that we don't go deep into questioning what are the risks that this child's been exposed to, how much exposure, how often is this child involved in domestic violence? Is there also physical abuse against the children occurring? What about the children's observation of threats to the mother? And what is that impact on these children of all of that exposure? And then beyond that, what are the safety or protective strategies, protective factors in that child's life? So I think a much deeper assessment is needed in our child welfare systems and in our custody family courts, where there's custody decisions being made about children's experience of domestic violence, how they've been exposed, involved, the impact on them, and what protective and risk factors are present in their lives.
The Children's Aid Societies are mandated by provincial legislation in Ontario, the Child and Family Services Act, and our responsibility is to determine if a child's in need of protection. Domestic violence isn't specifically identified as a reason for a child to be in need of protection. However, it often is true that in domestic violence situations where families have had that occurring in their family, children are at risk of physical harm themselves, have been physically harmed, or are at risk of emotional harm as a result of being exposed to woman abuse. As part of the Children's Aid involvement in families where there is risk, we would always interview the children separately and individually and privately to determine whether or not there's a concern about themselves being harmed, or what they've observed, what they're exposed to, and how they perceive it and understand it. So we're assessing the impact when it comes to children. We're trying to determine how has this affected them.
I find that often judges will resist saying no contact for this father until X, Y, or Z has been done. I think judges and many people in our society believe that fathers have a right to access to their children, and therefore will assign at least supervised visitation of some kind, be it in a professional supervised visitation center. So judges have many options to choose from no contact to supervised visitation to supervised exchange to unsupervised exchanges and unsupervised visits with children. What I find happen is that judges will assign rarely no contact, but if they assign supervised visitation, it's temporary, only for a few months on the track to unsupervised, unrestricted contact with the children, between the father and the children. What I would like to see courts do is first of all, in some cases, decide it's too dangerous for this father at this point to have access to the children. Until he's made changes, shows that he's safe to be with the children, he should not have contact. Bring that father back at a certain point and review what has he done, what changes has he made, and then decide, okay, supervised visitation. But not just assign it for a period of time and then have unrestricted visitation, but have another review.